I wasn't planning to review this game, to be completely honest with you, but just as in the title of this video, Resident Evil Village managed to positively surprise me in many of its aspects. The setting, the exploration, the little twist it does on the open world genre, the jumbled but very fun mess of different kinds of enemies ripped out straight from many classic horror films, books and folklore fables, and one utterly spine-chilling sequence, the Beneviento mention, that borrows its influence from so many horror movies that it's almost hard to count. Henceforth, by the middle of my playthrough, at the time it all seemed to me like this might be actually one of the best games in this series, which now I know it clearly is not, although it still might be worth your time. However, my position on the Resident Evil games may be a little biased towards the more recent outings, since throughout the years, starting about the time when Resident Evil 4 first released, all the way through 5 and 6, I couldn't really get into it, and since my transition from a PC gamer only to a person now owning multiple consoles took place after all of these released, I never got the chance to check out the older titles, nor was I really all that intrigued about the idea of it. But something changed with the release of Resident Evil 7. It might be the switch to the FPS perspective, it might have been just the right time in my life, or something completely different. The point being the fact that the series finally clicked with me. The mix of Metroidvania-esque exploration with survival horror elements plus a really decent combat system and a story that was quite generous to a new fan of the series with only bits and bobs of knowledge of its origin story, a story which obviously with time revealed its ties to the previous games but never overburdened me with the fact of their existence. It all made 7 a game I remember fondly to this very day. Because of that, when I've had the occasion, I've jumped in on the hype train for both Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3, which became an opportunity for me to get acquainted with the so-called best entries to the series with a new modern coat of paint. Both of these games were truly awesome, but what worried me was the slow and creeping transition from being focused on both exploration and slower and more tactical combat against the infected, being more linear experiences in the vein of the entries to the series that I've never could get into. This applies way more to RE3 though, so when I heard that the next entry in the series is a direct continuation of RE7 and might even be set in an open world setting, Capcom did manage to capture my interest. And then obviously there was, well, that.
Oh, be careful what you wish for, Ethan Winters.
It's no secret that Resident Evil 8 is a thematic spiritual successor to Resident Evil 4. It might not be a carbon copy of that title, but the influences of that entry to the series are beyond doubt sprinkled all the way throughout it. But thankfully, there is no characters to escort in this one. Most of the friendly NPCs in this entry die in few of the very first cutscenes. And just as any other game in the series, Resident Evil 8, or simply Village, is a survival horror game that mixes in both elements of first and third-person shooters with exploratory Metroidvania-like elements, and finishes it off with a solid dose of overall absurdity of stuff that happens before your eyes. And what happens before your eyes can be truly magnificent. To get the technicalities out of the way, RE8 runs on the newest version of Capcom's in-house RE engine that was used in the newest Devil May Cry 5, Monster Hunter Rise, and obviously all the new Resident Evil games. And just like RE2 and RE3 remakes, Village pushes the technological splendor of this engine even further, expanding on its use of ray tracing all the way throughout the title. Although it seems that its implementation might not be quite to the par when compared to things like Control or recently released Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition. But you probably should just watch Digital Foundry's videos on this topic if you want more detail. From my own layman's perspective on the way this game's presentation looks, I can clearly state that the level of detail all across all of the game's numerous locations, the amazing looking character and enemy models, effective use of lighting all the way throughout, great HDR implementation, which for technical reasons I wasn't able to capture correctly on my rig, the art design of both the world and many of the folklore-inspired enemies, even if some of their inspirations might be too heavy-handed. The feeling of the overall cohesive nature of the presentation, even in the face of the extremely eclectic amounts of styles of locations this game switches between, it all made my jaw drop many times. I mean, we both have here a wonderful classicist castle, an underground factory, a haunted house taken straight out from something like PT, and even a Lovecraftian underwater village. And we even have nods to things like Lord of the Rings sprinkled here and there in the game world. All of this combined made me absolutely fall in love with the visuals on display on here. And yes, there is plenty of low detailed textures in many places, and the former mentioned ray tracing implementation can hinder your performance on even the most insane of rigs, meanwhile being quite low res and cheap looking in many spots. Anyway, I still was left impressed with the overall design of the game. And since I've already touched up on the performance of this, I just wanted to note that I hardly noticed any truly severe frame drops in this title. Obviously, there were situations when it dipped well below 60 FPS when maxed out, but I think dropping ray tracing and maybe using the variable rate shading if you have a modern AMD graphics card probably could help you quite a bit, but it could make stuff a bit blurry unfortunately. I'll admit that I would prefer to see some DLSS options added to this one, since this one option seems like a godsend. But I have no idea how viable that is. I guess that is also up to the guys at Digital Foundry to assess. Where I have a bit of a problem is in the sound design and quality of sound in this game. Whereas the general ambience of the in-game world is made amazingly well, here I can yet again point to the amazing haunted house sequence that plays out in the mid-game. And the sounds of enemies and weapons are effective enough, there is clearly some sort of an issue when it comes to the voiceover quality in this title. The very first sequence with all of the main antagonists at the very start of the game is a great example of this. It almost seems like the recordings of some of the actors are clipped or just taken straight from the soundstage. You can basically hear the echo of the room they recorded these in. That is completely at odds with the scene at hand. Also, some of the characters' voices sound a little muffled or just too quiet. Although I will have to admit that this issue wasn't as noticeable in the later stages, it certainly left a bad taste. As to the music in this game, except for the opening and ending credits music and the final boss theme, yeah, except that one, there's hardly anything in this that I would consider memorable. It feels that this game knows this, since even the classic saber theme in this game is barely audible. RE7 did this one a lot better. No matter how great or bad the audiovisual presentation of a game like this is, it needs to first and foremost play well. And in this regard, Resident Evil Village does quite a lot of things right. We all knew, even from the earliest press releases, that this entry in the series was intended to romance with the idea of a semi-open world setting. And what's surprising about this is that they actually kind of got it. It's true that what we're dealing with in here is not an open world per se, at least not in the style of the overly bloated Ubisoft titles. It's rather a collection of different areas that interconnect with each other, all glued together by the titular hemlock. And so the village itself serves as a sort of a hub you return to every now and then, with some differences between each time you're back. And meanwhile, its size might not impress, and not go into hundreds of square kilometers, amount of stuff to do around this relatively small area compensates for that in full. Be it just checking house for supplies to get ready for another enemy or boss encounter, engaging in some fights with enemies trying to get a jump on you, or just solving some rather simple yet fun puzzles. Let's hang on to that thought, since puzzles in this game, as well as in many games in the series, are usually both directly tied to the story progression, as well as the player's need to look into every nook and cranny of the current area, in search of supplies, obviously. When going through the main storyline attractions that this game has prepared, most of the puzzles will usually just demand you to find an appropriate item and then use it in the right spot. Some of them need you to interpret a piece of text to then interact with some objects, and other ones need you to place some elements so that they can form a pattern. Nothing out of the ordinary for the series, but still really enjoyable. The only criticism that I have towards some of these puzzle sections is the initial vagueness of what you're supposed to do. There were some of them that I thought I solved, but they refused to cooperate before I abandoned any semblance of logic and just tried any combination that I could think of. There are also some ball labyrinth puzzles that are all optional, and meanwhile not always being exactly fair with the physics they apply to that spinning object, nor are they always giving you a clear view of what you're doing. They at least give you some decent rewards that you can later monetize in the in-game shop. Ah, yes, the Duke, or simply put, the in-game trader in this game, is one of the elements that is returning from the days of Resident Evil 4 dominance. He's a handful addition when trespassing through many hostile environments, letting you to buy ammo, new weapons, storage upgrades or ammo schematics. But that's not all, he will also buy anything from you. And since this game includes a separate item category of treasures that thankfully don't occupy your very precious inventory space, it is strongly incentivized to go out into the game world looking for these. What's more, some of the treasure items can be combined together to create even more valuable versions of themselves. And where you should spend most of your hard-earned lei, the in-game currency, is in the upgrades menu that will let you upgrade stuff like damage, rate of fire, reload speed, or ammo capacity. Believe me, most of this stuff will help you out the most in the long run, especially when facing a really bullet-spongy optional boss. Selling your stuff and upgrading your weapons is not the only thing that the Duke does. It will also prepare you special meals that will permanently boost your health, blocking power, or speed of your movement. But to be able to use these upgrades, you need to first go out into the village and search for animals to hunt and scavenge for meat, that you can then drop off at his shop. Even if you don't have all of the required animal parts, you still can give them to the Duke, to not clutter your inventory space. Convenience at its best. But cooking animal products is not what makes this game a survival horror. It is in the need to fend off all of the whole menagerie of folkloric beasts and creatures by the means of combat. And here is where
Resident Evil 8
can shine in its perverse glory of destruction, by the means of using all manners of pistols, shotguns, rifles, explosives, and thankfully, an indestructible knife. It's clear that this game is much more action-heavy than RE7, but thankfully the game eases you in slowly, both structurally and also when it comes to the amounts of on-screen enemies, but as it develops further and further, you start encountering hordes of lichens and other monstrosities that are all quite bullet-spongy, but mostly quite fast. So the tactic of trying to headshot everything in your way is mostly no longer viable in here. You start to improvise solutions to deal with larger groups of foes, but you still need to give them a fair share of your lead. Because of the amounts of ammo you need to use to fell most of the enemies in this game, there obviously was a need to allow you to replenish it even when there is none of it to be found in the game world around you. Here is where the combination system, here transformed into a separate crafting menu, comes to your aid. And with the schematics that you can obtain from the trader, you can become your own mobile gunsmith. And with time, you can just stop worrying about not having enough ammo since you become stockpiled with it to the brim. And if that's not enough, if you have money to spare, you can just buy it from the Duke himself. Convenience, yet again. Alright, let's finally touch up on one of the most hyped elements of this game. The big vampire lady, Lady Dimitrescu. And let's keep this short. What she is just a weaker and less involved version of the RE2 remake Tyrant, and she's gone after the initial castle segment of the game. She makes for some quotable cutscenes, memes, has an okay boss fight, but all in all, she's even more of a joke than the RE3's Nemesis was. While we're at it, let's quickly talk about the bosses this game throws at you. First and foremost, I will admit that they can be quite creative. Design-wise, each and every fight has a different theme to it, but most of them really can be described as just a sequence where you need to fill your target with ammo until you get to the next phase, or a cutscene that will either end the fight or shake things up a tiny bit. Because of that, they are hardly a challenge. Also, the game offers you several optional boss fights that you can have in the semi-open world between the proper story content, but they are much less creative than the main bosses and can bug out quite easily since you can just leave the boss area at any time if you want to. And if you decide to take them on, they are even more straightforward and to the point. Just shoot and shoot and shoot and then shoot a little more and the big guy with an axe is dead. That's about it. Here's where we can address the elephant in the room. the difficulty of Resident Evil Village. To start off, I completed the game on standard. In many plays, as I mentioned earlier, I felt that most of the enemies as well as the bosses might have been a bit too easy. Even though they could take a real punch with the amounts of bullets they could soak up, they were never a real danger to me. In my 10-hour playthrough of this game, the only times I died were mainly because of a stupid error or getting blocked on something in the environment, not being able to move away. And even though some of the battles against the bigger hordes of enemies could raise my heart rate, I've never felt challenged by the game. On the contrary, most of the time I felt like it was perfectly fine for me to indulge in the fantasy of being an overpowered badass, murdering werewolves and gargoyles left and right. Unless you try the hardcore difficulty or even the Village of Shadows difficulty, which from what I've seen is pretty broken at this point, and might even make the very start of the game a pure symphony of suffering, unless that is what you want in a game. The other thing which surprised me quite a bit, even though it may seem obvious since this is also a horror game, was the fact of how effective some of these clearly only made for spooks elements of the game were. I'm also well aware that this statement will seemingly contradict what I said about this one, being more action heavy versus as horror focused as many parts of RE7. But let's just discuss this further so I can explain myself. Be it the sound design, a sudden jump scare caused by a tough enemy just appearing out of the impenetrable darkness, or the whole haunted house section that you play through in the mid-game, it all left a really strong impression on me. Why was this surprising? Mainly because of the fact that even though I'd consider RE7 a very creepy title that probably aimed to terrify you even more than this game, it never got under my nerves as much as some of the sequences in this game. It's clear that the developers here took some lessons straight from PT, Outlast and Amnesia games, as they probably realized that sometimes what makes stuff tense is the inability to defend oneself in any way or form in the face of terrifying things coming out of the dark. I will admit that the scares did not overstay their welcome, or maybe that they even lasted a bit too short for my taste, but remember, this is a 10+ hour game, and even one 40-minute and really tense horror section can leave a lasting influence on you. I'm well aware that up to this point, even after highlighting some of the issues that this title has technically or mechanically, I might have overall sounded quite positive about my experience with Resident Evil Village. But unfortunately now comes the time to talk about the weakest part of the whole package, the story, which up to this point I tried my best not to even mention. After the quick recap of the events of RE7 and watching a surprisingly well-made Tim Burton-esque intro animation that teases some of the encounters in the main game, we are quickly thrust back into the shoes of the big MC himself, Ethan Winters. He apparently now has a baby with his mold-infested, but cured from it in the canon ending of RE7, wife Mia, and then she is killed off by Chris Redfield just so the main character can have a reason to be angry at the only character coming off from the mainline series. What an intricate way to create conflict between them, isn't it? After a series of cutscenes and some linear walks through apparently the frozen wastes of Romania, Ethan ends up in the titular village, on a quest to save his daughter from the hands of the big vampire lady and other grotesque weirdos taken only seemingly out of folklore tales. Also, this might sound nitpicky, but why do all of these supposedly Romanian and German characters speak in perfect American accents?
That fool Heisenberg. Because he is in my castle and has already proven too much for my daughters to handle. When I find him... No, Mother Miranda. Yes, of course, I understand.
So in short, even though conceptually it is a breath of fresh air for the series, all in all it's just really bland. Most of the twists and turns you can sense from a mile away, and except for some really great set pieces and few well-directed moments of horror, it's hardly even exciting. If you're playing this title just for its storytelling, then it's hardly even worth your time, to be quite honest. Why that is? Well, we'll need to spoil some stuff. So if you don't want that, here's your cue for skipping to the next part of this video. Alright, let's speed this up or this will take us forever. After getting his hand bitten off, his legs and body pierced, his other hand chopped and then reattached on, not necessarily in that order, but let's not dwell on that, Ethan finally learns that his kidnapped daughter was, well, chopped and put into 4 jars. Yikes. And then given to 4 lords of the village that you've met a little ways back. And so Big Mommy, Alcinda Dimitrescu, is just one of the 4 lords, main bosses that you have to kill. After you do just that, and you're all buzzed up to kill the final boss of the game, surprise! She kills you instead, ripping your heart out. And from now on you play as Chris Redfield. After cutting through hordes and hordes of enemies, you finally find the antagonist's lab, which is probably the only true clear indicator of how all of this is tied to other games in the series, but it delivers all of the info you need as a set of journal logs. Then another surprise, you find Mia, who is not dead, because Miranda replaced her at the beginning trying to steal the baby. Woohoo! You were not expecting this, were you? After that we cut back to Ethan, who apparently is an immortal mold person. How, why, what does this even mean? Why can you even die in this game if he's unkillable? There are so many questions, but the game apparently needs to end now before explaining any of this shit. So you fight Mother Miranda, and Ethan seemingly sacrifices himself to destroy the new Romanian strand of the mold, never even showing his wonderful face to the camera. A quick note, you can actually see Ethan's face in the model gallery by the means of a particular mod, but why wouldn't they just use it in the game then, if he is in the cutscenes and he is being shown from the third-person perspective? Why hide it? And so with Ethan's sacrifice, this game ends. Except not, because the post-credit sequence suggests heavily that not only is Ethan's all-grown-up daughter a new protagonist of the series, the long shot of the car at the end with a passerby next to it strongly suggests that Ethan III the Bland is still alive, or at least he's still here, spiritually. Sequel bait is just too strong in this one. So yeah, this is clearly not the greatest plot ever told. All of the bits that are interesting or bits that would actually need some explanation are just left out in the air, and all of the world building of the entire game just vanishes straight up in a puff of smoke. Some of the in-game journals basically state that this is just a different kind of the progenitor virus already known from RE5 and other titles, so all of the explanation amounts to...
It's the virus, bro.
It almost seems like, in many parts, the developers just wanted to focus in their effort on the shock value of the grotesque depictions of body horror, or just weird stuff like putting a chopped up baby in multiple jars, and then develop some sort of a story around it that was good enough in their minds to justify you just pushing through it, to the point where, from what I've understood, this game explains the entire origin of the whole series in one of the weakest ways possible. I mean, the story in parts is so basic that you could have guessed most of it just by looking at the trailers for the game, and not even watching them back to back. When you think about what made RE7 so good, was the fact that although you didn't have much of a tie to anything in the previous entries, when the connection was finally made obvious, it felt interesting, or at least maybe it suggested that the direction for the new FPS perspective-based RE games could be different than you think. And here we have yet another title that falls into the trap of making their main protagonist a special, immortal, chosen one. This clearly is a jumbled mess of a plot that you try to piece from some poorly written journals and bits and pieces of dialogue that you pick up throughout the game. I will actually commend Capcom's bravery in trying something fresh with the whole folklore setting that this game has, but it all ended up in the same exact spot as all of the recent Resident Evil games. Big bad mutated thing is blown up and we ride off towards the sunset. This game is quite honestly a case-in point on how you can have an amazing story idea on paper, but when you actually put it on a monitor screen is where all of the problems actually begin. And then maybe you start to realize that it only sounds good when it stays on that piece of paper. Now that we're done with the main contents of this title, it being its main campaign, let's take a look at the additional modes included with it. First comes the Resident Evil Reverse standalone game, which is not out yet. Yikes. As to the return of the fabled Mercenaries mode, I will be completely honest here. After playing it for a little bit and getting through the first 3 stages of each of the first 3 locations, I just dropped it. The slow-paced movements of the main character that works perfectly in the survival horror-esque theme behind the main game is at a detriment here, and it feels even more jarring when you consider that when you start Mercenaries, the game starts playing some techno tracks in the background to pump you up for getting the best possible score in the shortest amount of time. but all it amounts to is to magnify the disconnect between this mode and the kind of a game RE8 truly is or attempts to be. There will be fans of the series who will enjoy this, I guess, but I personally gave it a pass. Resident Evil Village is not a perfect game by any stretch of the margin. If you're in here expecting a return to the roots of the series, you'll be disappointed. If you're in here for a great story, you'll be disappointed. And if you're in here for a game that will bring a revolution to the series, you will still be disappointed. But if what you're looking for is a really enjoyable, semi-open world, survival horror experience with great exploration, solid combat, neat scares, wonderful art design, cool even if really easy boss fights, and just tons of grotesque absurdity filling out your screen, missing out on this title would truly be a mistake. And that's probably what surprised me the most about all of this, that even after going from singing praises of RE8 until the later half of the game, and then begrudgingly starting to wish for its story to just finish its bullshit, I'm coming off quite content with what I got from it. It is for you, my dear viewer, to decide if being just content with it is good enough.
How can a man be almost dead? That's a question for the wise.
I thank you for making it all the way through this video. This review in many ways was also as much of a surprise to me as it was to the 3 or 4 people waiting patiently for the eventual Condemned Criminal Origins video. But to keep true to my word, it is... Sayonara.